Invisible Woman's redesign. If there's one era Marvel fans always look back on with a mix of nostalgia and second-hand embarrassment, it's the 1990s. Sales were dropping, readers were shifting toward flashier characters like the X-Men, and classic teams like the Fantastic Four were starting to feel outdated. Marvel knew it. Writers knew it, and editors definitely knew it. So what did they do? They tried to reinvent everything. And I mean everything. New costumes, darker tones, edgier designs, and why is that? Grabbing attention fast, even if it meant completely abandoning what made these characters work in the first place. And unfortunately, Invisible Woman ended up right in the middle of that chaos. This whole thing really kicks off in the mid-90s, during a period where Sue Storm's dark persona Malice was still influencing her character. Now Sue had already gone through some serious character development. She was stronger, more confident, more assertive, but instead of expressing that through storytelling alone, Marvel decided to visually scream it at the audience by completely redesigning her outfit. We're talking full-on attention-grabbing overhaul that felt like it came straight out of a rated R comic. Sue's new costume ditched the iconic, clean blue and white Fantastic Four uniform for something way more revealing. You've got exposed shoulders, bare thighs, a cut-off midriff, and of course the infamous four-shaped boob window right in the center. And look, comic books have always had some level of exaggeration, but this felt extra. It didn't match Sue's personality at all. She's supposed to be one of the most composed, intelligent, and emotionally grounded members of the team, and suddenly she's dressed like she's trying to outshine every 90s anti-hero on the market. Marvel actually tried to justify this outfit in story. The idea was that Sue designed the costume to get the attention of her husband, Mr. Fantastic, because he's always busy, always distracted, always deep in some scientific problem. So the logic was, hey, maybe if I wear something more eye-catching, he'll finally notice me. And okay, on paper, that could have been a cute moment, I guess, but the execution just didn't land. So Marvel realized pretty quickly that this wasn't it. The costume didn't last long at all. Within just a handful of issues, Sue was already moving away from it, and eventually returning to a more classic, practical look, and the outfit just kind of disappeared. Kitty Pryde was way too young to be dating Colossus. The X-Men have always been known for their relationships just as much as their powers. You've got classics like Cyclops and Jean Grey, Rogue and Gambit, even Storm and Forge. These relationships help define the emotional core of the team, but not every X-Men romance aged well. And one of the most uncomfortable to look back on is between Kitty Pryde and Colossus, because unlike the others, this one started with an age gap that's hard to ignore. Kitty Pryde was introduced in Uncanny X-Men 129 by Chris Claremont and John Byrne, and right from the start she was young, like really young. She was around 13 or 14 years old when she joined the team. Meanwhile, Colossus was portrayed as being around 18 to 19 at the time. So when their relationship started developing, the age gap was right there on the page. And while Kitty having a crush on Colossus, that's normal. That's something a lot of people can relate to. But the story didn't just stop there. It actually leaned into the idea of a real relationship forming between them. The comics didn't really treat the situation as problematic. Instead, it was framed as a sweet, innocent romance. There are moments of flirting, emotional bonding, and even kissing, all presented like this is just another X-Men love story. But when you actually stop and think about it, it's a 14-year-old girl and a guy who's basically an adult. And the fact that it wasn't really questioned at the time makes it stand out even more today. The issue isn't that Kitty had feelings, it's that the narrative allowed those feelings to be normalized. Today, writers would handle this very differently, either by keeping it one-sided or addressing the age gap directly. But back then, they didn't do that. To be fair, as time went on, both Kitty Pryde and Colossus grew up, and their relationship became a lot more normal once they were both adults. The Wasp in a Room Full of Men. Wasp debuted in Tales to Astonish issue 44 and quickly became one of Marvel's most recognizable female heroes. Sure, she had that playful, fashionable personality, but she was also brave, sharp, and fully capable of holding her own in a fight. Over time, she'd even go to become a leader of the Avengers. So yeah, Janet was never supposed to be some shallow character, which is exactly why one particular moment early in her story feels so weird. This moment happens in Tales to Astonish issue 51, where Ant-Man and the Wasp are working with the authorities to stop a villain called Human Top. The guy is basically a human tornado, spinning around, causing chaos, and no one can catch him. So naturally, there's a serious strategy meeting going on. Heroes, police, everyone trying to figure out a plan. You'd expect Janet to be part of that, right? Offering input, thinking things through, being an equal partner in the situation. Instead, we get one of the most bizarre thought bubbles in early Marvel history. While everyone else is focused on stopping a dangerous villain, Janet's internal monologue is basically her being happy that she's in a room full full of men. That's it. She's just vibing because she's surrounded by guys. And look, it's not even played as a joke or a quick throwaway line. It's presented as a genuine moment of self-reflection. It's awkward, it's out of place, and it completely clashes with what her character is supposed to be. Even in her early appearances, Wasp wasn't written as unintelligent or useless. It's the opposite. So to suddenly have her reduced to this kind of one-dimensional thinking feels like a step backward. Today, this kind of writing just doesn't hold up. It feels outdated, even embarrassing, especially when you know how great the Wasp eventually becomes. Spider-Man had a real problem with protests. From day one, Peter Parker wasn't some perfect hero. He struggled with money, school, relationships, and just life in general. That's what made the early Amazing Spider-Man run so special. Peter felt like a real person living in a real world. But toward the end of Ditko's time on the book, something started to shift. The tone got a bit more rigid, a bit more opinionated, and it wasn't just about villains or superhero drama anymore. It started creeping into how Peter viewed real-world issues. By the mid-1960s, especially around the Amazing Spider-Man issue 36 to 38, you can start to feel Steve Ditko's personal philosophy influencing the comic more directly. Ditko was heavily inspired by objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, which emphasized individual responsibility, discipline, and a strong dislike for collective movements like protests. And this is where things get interesting, because the 1960s were full of protests, civil rights movements, anti-war demonstrations, student activism. It was everywhere. So naturally, those real-world events started showing up in comics. But instead of presenting them neutrally, Ditko's perspective came through pretty clearly in how they were portrayed. In The Amazing Spider-Man issue 38, by the way, Ditko's final issue before leaving Marvel, there's a scene where Peter arrives at college and encounters a group of student protesters. Now you'd expect Peter, the underground hero who's been misunderstood his whole life, to maybe sympathize a little, but nope. He came off as annoyed, dismissive, even borderline disgusted by them. Visually, Ditko draws the protesters in a chaotic, almost negative light, and Peter's body language makes it clear he's not on their side. What's really interesting though is that Stan Lee seems to try and soften this through dialogue and thought bubbles, almost like he's trying to balance Ditko's harsher take. You can feel this weird tension between the art and the writing, like two different perspectives fighting on the same page. The problem is, this doesn't really feel like Peter Parker. This is a character who's been bullied, judged, and constantly misunderstood. If anyone should understand people standing up for what they believe in, it's him. So seeing him react so negatively to protests feels kind of off. When a character stops feeling like themselves and starts reflecting the creator too directly, it breaks that connection with the audience. Magneto's destruction of the Ultimate Universe. Back in the early 2000s, Marvel tried to reboot everything, but without touching the main timeline, and that's how the Ultimate Universe was born, starting with Ultimate Spider-Man in 2000. The whole point was to modernize Marvel for a new generation. You've got clean continuity, updated origins, bold reinterpretations, and it kind of worked. Characters like Spider-Man, the Ultimates, and even the X-Men got fresh, grounded takes. But at the same time, this universe also leaned way more into edgy storytelling. Relationships were messier, characters were harsher, and the tone was darker overall. So when things eventually started spiraling, they went completely off the rails. At the center of this chaos was Magneto, and unlike his main universe counterpart, this version was far less morally complex and way more extreme. Over time, his ideology shifted from mutant protection to full-on mutant supremacy, with zero hesitation to wipe out humanity if needed. This all comes to a head in Ultimatum, written by Jeff Loeb. After the death of his children, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, Magneto completely snaps and just decides to end the world, literally. He reverses the Earth's magnetic poles, triggering global disasters like tsunamis, earthquakes, and mass destruction on a scale that wipes out millions in seconds. Ultimatum goes all in on shock value. Characters were killed in the most brutal, unnecessary ways possible. Wasp gets eaten by Blob, then Blob himself gets his head bitten off by Giant Man, Doctor Strange gets his head exploded by Dormammu like it's nothing. Even Wolverine gets completely incinerated, leaving only his skeleton. And the thing is, none of it feels earned. There's no emotional build-up, no payoff, and no real purpose behind these deaths. It just feels like the story is trying to outdo itself in how far it can go. In most versions, Magneto is complex, sometimes even understandable. Here, he's basically reduced to a one-note villain, whose entire plan is just destroy everything. There's no exploration of mutant to human conflict, nothing. His actions end up feeling like a random switch flipped for the sake of the plot. And because his this plan causes so much destruction so quickly, it robs the story of tension. There's no time to process everything. So this comic single-handedly damaged the reputation of the Ultimate Universe. What was supposed to be a massive, unforgettable finale ended up being remembered as one of Marvel's most controversial and poorly received events, and Marvel itself seemed to backpedal afterward, soft rebooting the universe instead of fully ending it. Invisible Girl's place on the Fantastic Four. One of the most unique ideas came in Fantastic Four issue 11 in 1963 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Part of that issue was dedicated to answering real fan letters, but here's the twist. The answers were written in character as the Fantastic Four themselves. It was actually a super creative idea for the time. Fans got to feel like they were directly talking to their favorite heroes, and the team even re-explained their origin and addressed common questions. But then things got awkward, because one of the biggest fan complaints at the time was about Invisible Girl and whether she even deserved to be on the team in the first place. You got to remember, this was the early 1960s. Comics were still heavily influenced by outdated gender roles, and female characters were often written as secondary to the male heroes. At this point, Sue Storm, still known as Invisible Girl, mainly had invisibility powers. No force fields yet, no powerhouse moments, nothing like what she'd later become. So a lot of readers generally saw her as the weak link of the team, and instead of quietly improving her character over time, Marvel decided to directly respond to these criticisms inside the comic itself. So how did the team defend Sue? Well, not great. The argument basically boiled down to, yeah, she might be not as powerful, but she inspires us. Reed and Ben get weirdly defensive, almost angry, but the actual points they make, all I'm gonna say is that feminists won't like that. There's even this underlying tone of why would you want a woman who fights like us anyway? It's supposed to be a heartful defense, but it ends up sounding like they are unintentionally proving the critics right. Now, to be fair, this was very much a product of its time. The early Marvel era was groundbreaking in a lot of ways, but it still carried a lot of the social norms of the 1960s. Female characters were often written in more passive roles, but looking back now, it's honestly kind of embarrassing. The funniest and the best part of this whole situation is what happened next. Less than a year later, Marvel started upgrading Sue's powers, giving her the ability to create invisible force fields, turning her into the Invisible Woman we know today, and from that point on, she became one of the most powerful members of the Fantastic Four, arguably the most powerful in many situations. Captain America fought a villain powered by racism. Before Marvel was even officially called Marvel, it was known as Timely Comics, and one of its biggest early hits was Captain America Comics. Created in 1941 by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, Cap quickly became a symbol of patriotism, especially during World War II. The comics were pumping out stories constantly, and because demand was so high, multiple writers and artists contributed to the series. One of those writers was Otto Binder. But here's the thing, when you are producing that much content that quickly, not every idea is well thought out, and sometimes those ideas end up aging really badly. In one of the later issues of Captain America Comics, Binder introduced a villain known as the Black Talon. That sounds like your typical Golden Age bad guy, and the story, often referred to as the Case of the Black Talon, revolves around a painter who becomes a murderer after receiving a hand transplant from a black man who had been executed. And the implication is that the evil comes from the hand itself. Not trauma, not psychology, not anything grounded, just the idea that the transplanted black hand is somehow corrupting him and turning him into a killer. And yeah, when you really think about it, the entire premise is built on a deeply racist idea. Even for the time, it leans heavily into harmful stereotypes and fears that were unfortunately common in media back then. The worst part, this wasn't just a one-off weird story. The Black Talon actually became a recurring villain for a short period. The 1940s had a lot of racial tension and deeply ingrained prejudice, and unfortunately, that made its way into storytelling. But what makes this one stand out is how blatant it is, and when you compare that to what Captain America is supposed to represent, it creates this weird contradiction. Comics have evolved a lot since then, and Marvel has done a much better job representing diversity and tackling serious themes with more care. But moments like this are still part of the history, and honestly, they are worth talking about, not to cancel the past, but to understand how far things have come. Gwen Stacy in Sin's Past. Before Mary Jane Watson became the love interest everyone associates with Spider-Man, there was Gwen Stacy, and for a long time, she was everything to Spider-Man. Introduced in The Amazing Spider-Man 31 in 1965, Gwen represented Peter's normal life. She was smart, kind, grounded, basically the opposite of the chaos that came with being Spider-Man. And when she died in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 121 at the hands of the Green Goblin, it became one of the most defining tragedies in comic book history. That moment showed that being a superhero has real consequences, and for decades, decades, Gwen's death was treated with respect, almost like sacred ground in Spider-Man's story. Fast forward to 2004, and Marvel decides to revisit Gwen's legacy in one of the most controversial storylines ever, Sin's Past, written by G. Michael Straczynski. So Peter discovers secrets about Gwen's past that he never knew, but the actual reveal, well, the story claims that Gwen had a secret relationship with Norman Osborn, and not only that, she had his children. The same man who would later kill her was secretly having an affair with her behind Peter's back. For this story to work, it basically rewrites her personality entirely. Suddenly, Gwen is portrayed as someone who cheated on Peter, kept massive secrets, and made choices that don't line up with how she'd been written for decades. It turns her from a symbol of Peter's greatest loss into a plot device, something used purely to create drama, and the details don't help either. The idea that she would willingly get involved with Norman Osborn, her boyfriend's best friend's father, a man significantly older, and someone who would later become a monster, is just hard to accept. It doesn't feel like a natural extension of her story, almost like the story is bending her character just to create a shocking twist. Fans obviously did not take this well, and honestly, it's easy to see why. Messing with her legacy was always going to be risky, but Sin's Past completely ignored what made the legacy work. Over time, this storyline became infamous, constantly showing up in discussions about the worst Marvel stories ever written. Eventually, years later, it was effectively retconned, with explanations tying it back to characters like Mysterio, but by that point, the damage was already done. Skrull Kill Crew. If there's one thing Marvel loved doing in the late 90s, it was taking wild concepts and pushing them as far as possible. And right in the middle of that era, we got Skrull Kill Crew. It builds off an old Skrulls concept from Fantastic Four issue 2. Basically, some Skrulls ended up as cows, got turned into meat, and people ate them. And those people, they gained powers. Not only that, they could now see Skrulls in their true form. So naturally, they decided to hunt them down. And just like that, Skrull Kill Crew is born. It's ridiculous, over the top, and very much a product of its time. But then, just bear with me for a sec. You've got a group of regular people suddenly thrown into a secret war against alien infiltrators. There's paranoia, action, and all the ingredients for something interesting, especially considering how big the Skrulls would later become in events like Secret Invasion. If the comic had leaned into the absurdity while still keeping some narrative focus, it might have been remembered as a fun cult classic, but it went full edgy 90s. One of the members of the team is a character named Moonstomper, and he's straight up written as a racist neo-Nazi. He openly makes racist remarks toward Ryder, the leader of the team, idolizes fascist figures like Baron Strucker, and the weirdest part, the comic doesn't really do anything meaningful with it. He's just there, dropping hateful comments in a story that's otherwise supposed to be about fighting alien invaders. So basically you included a character who embodies real-world hate and do nothing with it. No commentary, no critique, and no payoff. You just throw in a racist character for edge. The idea of people getting powers from eating Skrull meat, weird. A team hunting shape-shifting aliens may be a cool concept, but adding a one-dimensional racist character purely for shock value, that's where it completely loses the plot. Mockingbird let a guy fall to his death. For a long time, Mockingbird was one of those characters who fans liked, but Marvel never fully pushed to the front. That changed in 2016, when she got her own solo series written by Chelsea Cain, and honestly the run was really solid. It had personality, humor, and a unique voice that made it stand out from typical superhero books. It even gained a bit of a cult following, despite not lasting very long. This was one of those underrated runs fans love to recommend, the kind that feels fresh and different. But then, the final issue dropped a retcon that completely changed how people looked at one of Mockingbird's most important stories, and not in a good way. To understand why this went so wrong, you gotta go back to the original storyline in West Coast Avengers from the 1980s. During a time travel arc, Mockingbird ends up stranded in the Old West, where she crosses paths with a character called the Phantom Rider. Now this dude quickly became obsessed with her, and things take a really dark turn. He drugs her, manipulates her, and basically tries to force himself on her. Naturally, Mockingbird is furious. When they finally confront each other, they fight, and the Phantom Rider ends up hanging off a cliff. And what does she do? She lets go. She lets him fall to his death, and while that's intense, it made sense in context. Then comes the twist in Mockingbird 2016 issue 8. Instead of sticking with the original interpretation, the story retcons the entire situation. Suddenly, it suggested that Mockingbird Bird's relationship with the Phantom Rider was actually consensual. The idea is that she willingly had an affair with him, and that Hawkeye, her partner at the time, basically convinced himself she had been drugged because he couldn't handle the idea of her cheating. So now she basically let a guy fall to his death for no reason. And yeah, that raises a lot of questions, like why and what was the point of changing this? In the original version, her decision, while extreme, it's understandable. In the retcon, that motivation is gone. Now it just looks like she let someone die for no clear reason. And on top of that, it undermines the seriousness of what the original story was dealing with. Professor X's crush on a young Jean Grey. When X-Men 1 came out in 1963, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were still figuring out the tone and direction of the series. The team was meant to be a group of teenage mutants learning to control their powers under the guidance of the wise and noble Professor Charles Xavier. But buried among all the science fiction and mutant metaphors, there's a weird, uncomfortable subplot. Professor X has romantic feelings for Jean Grey, his teenage student. At first, you can almost miss it. It's just hinted at in a few scenes. Jean, being the only girl on the team at the time, already had everyone from Cyclops to Angel crushing on her. But then in X-Men issue 3, readers got one of the strangest reveals in early Marvel history. In a quiet moment, Charles internally admits, as though I could help worrying about the one I love, but I can never tell her. I have no right. Not while I'm the leader of the X-Men and confined to this wheelchair. And with that, the comic basically confirmed that the world's most respected mutant leader had a crush on a 16-year-old student. Now, in fairness, early comics weren't written with the same long-term continuity or sensitivity we expect today. Back then, Xavier wasn't necessarily meant to be the wise old mentor he became later. He was just prematurely bald, maybe in his early 30s. Still, even if you shave a few years off his age, that's a grown man having romantic thoughts about a teenage girl. It doesn't get less creepy with context, it just gets weird in a different way. Fans and writers quietly dropped the idea pretty quickly. Later stories completely ignored Xavier's early crush and instead focused on him as a father figure or moral leader. Jean's relationship with Cyclops became the emotional core of the series, and Xavier's romantic side was redirected toward adult women like Moira McTaggart and Lilandra. Marvel basically pretended the whole thing never happened, and honestly, that was probably the best move they could have made. Looking back, it's one of those relics from the awkward early years of superhero comics. Even brilliant creators like Lee and Kirby didn't always think through every subplot. Today, most fans treat it as a bizarre, slightly embarrassing footnote in X-Men history.